Alberta is pushing a new oil pipeline to the west coast, and it could change where Canada sells its oil and what you pay for energy, taxes, and trade fights in the years ahead. For you, this is not just a pipeline map through northern British Columbia. It is a fight over whether Canada stays tied to one main customer, the United States, or finally builds a direct door to Asia. The strange part is this: the project is being sold as national strength, but the biggest battle may happen inside Canada itself, because before a single barrel moves, Ottawa, Alberta, British Columbia, coastal First Nations, oil companies, environmental groups, and foreign buyers all have to answer one question. Is this Canada's next great nation-building project, or another multi-billion-dollar gamble waiting to explode? Alberta is now studying 3 possible routes for a major new oil export pipeline through British Columbia, with northern ports like Prince Rupert at the center of the discussion. The goal is simple to explain but extremely hard to execute. Move at least 1 million barrels a day of Alberta bitumen toward the Pacific coast, load it onto ships, and sell more Canadian crude directly to Asian markets like Japan, South Korea, China, and India. That would mark one of the biggest energy shifts in modern Canadian history. For decades, Canada has produced enormous amounts of oil, but most of it has moved south into the United States. American refiners have been the main customer. American infrastructure has been the main exit route. American pricing power has shaped Canadian profits. And that is exactly the problem Alberta says it wants to fix. Because when one buyer controls most of your market, that buyer has leverage. It can shape prices. It can shape politics. It can shape the entire relationship. And in the age of tariffs, trade threats, supply chain fights, and rising nationalism, Alberta's message is becoming more direct. Canada cannot call itself an energy superpower if it can only sell its energy through one main door. That is the heart of this story. It is not only about oil. It is about leverage. It is about sovereignty. It is about whether Canada can build big infrastructure anymore without getting trapped in court fights, cost overruns, regional anger, and political paralysis. And for the United States, this matters too, because if Canada builds a direct oil route to Asia, it changes the balance between American buyers and Canadian producers. It gives Alberta another option. It gives Ottawa another bargaining chip. And it tells Washington that Canadian energy does not have to wait forever for American approval. This push gained real force after the Canada-Alberta Memorandum of Understanding, signed on November 27, 2025. The agreement called for one or more private sector built and financed pipelines, Indigenous co-ownership and economic benefits, and at least 1 million barrels a day of low-emission Alberta bitumen moving through a route that increases export access to Asian markets. It also set a target. The pipeline application should be ready for submission to the Major Projects Office on or before July 1, 2026. That date matters. July 1, 2026 is not a far-off dream on a whiteboard. It is a political deadline. It forces Alberta, Ottawa, industry, and potential Indigenous partners to move from speeches into details. Which route? Which port? Which companies? Which First Nations? Which financing model? Which environmental rules? Which federal laws have to change? And that is where the story gets much harder. Alberta has committed $14 million for early planning work. South Bow, Enbridge, and Trans Mountain have been named around technical advisory work, but there is still no clear private builder publicly committed to take the full risk of constructing the line. That is a major detail, because the Canada-Alberta Agreement talks about private sector financing. But Canada's recent pipeline history has shown that private can become public very quickly when politics, protests, court delays, and cost inflation collide. The warning sign is Trans Mountain. The Trans Mountain expansion was supposed to solve part of Canada's tidewater problem by nearly tripling capacity from Alberta to the Pacific coast. It began commercial operations in 2024 and brought the system to about 890,000 barrels per day. But the project became a political and financial scar because its cost rose to around $34 billion after years of delay and government ownership. That is why every supporter of this new northern route faces the same uncomfortable question. Who pays if the cost doubles? Who pays if it triples? Who pays if years of legal fights turn a national project into another taxpayer rescue? Supporters argue that this time can be different. They say a new route can be designed with Indigenous equity from the start, not added late as a political patch. They say Asian demand gives Canada a larger customer base. They say a new West Coast corridor would reduce Canada's dependence on American buyers and create jobs, royalties, investment, and national energy security. And they have a real economic argument. Canada is one of the world's major oil producers. Alberta's oil sands remain a huge resource base. Canadian heavy crude is valuable to refiners built to process it. And if the world is going to keep using oil for years while the energy transition unfolds unevenly, Canada wants to capture more value from its own production instead of selling most of it into a limited North American system. But critics have an argument too, and it is not a small one. They say the world may not need another expensive oil export pipeline by the time this project is built. They say global oil demand is uncertain. They say climate policy, electric vehicles, investor caution, and possible oversupply could turn a pipeline built for long-term growth into a stranded asset. The International Energy Agency has warned of a possible large oil surplus in 2026, with market analysis showing forecasts implying a surplus of more than 4 million barrels per day if supply keeps outrunning demand. That does not prove oil demand collapses forever, but it does show why critics say long-life oil megaprojects carry real market risk. That is the tension. Alberta sees a closing window to build before the world locks in new trade patterns. Opponents see a dangerous rush into a project that may arrive late, cost too much, and create environmental risk that coastal communities would carry long after politicians move on. And then there is the legal wall, sitting directly in the proposed path. The Oil Tanker Moratorium Act, passed in 2019, blocks large tankers carrying crude oil or persistent oil from loading, unloading, mooring, or anchoring at ports or marine installations on British Columbia's north coast in the covered region. The law applies to tankers carrying more than 12,500 metric tons of crude or persistent oil. That law is not a side issue. It is central. If Alberta wants a northern BC export line, and if the route depends on a port like Prince Rupert or nearby northern coast options, the tanker ban has to be changed, suspended, bypassed, or repealed. And that is where Ottawa faces the political trap. Because the federal government can talk about national interest, it can talk about energy security, it can talk about diversifying exports away from the United States. But if the project requires weakening the tanker moratorium, then British Columbia, coastal First Nations, and environmental groups will argue that Ottawa is asking one region to carry the environmental risk so another region can gain the economic reward. That argument is powerful, because for coastal communities, this is not just about barrels, markets, or GDP. It is about water. It is about fisheries. It is about food. It is about culture. It is about what happens if one accident changes a coastline for decades. Coastal First Nations have already made their position clear. In October 2025, Coastal First Nations said they remained opposed to any project or proponent that would bring crude oil tankers into their territories and said they remained committed to upholding the Oil Tanker Moratorium Act. Marilyn Slett, the president of Coastal First Nations, later urged Prime Minister Mark Carney to maintain and protect the tanker moratorium, warning that one spill could threaten their way of life. That means this pipeline is not only an engineering project, it is a consent project. It is a trust project. And right now, trust is in short supply. British Columbia Premier David Eby has also pushed back. He has questioned why Ottawa is focused on an Alberta oil pipeline, while BC industries like softwood lumber face severe trade pressure. That matters because it shows the regional anger is not just environmental, it is economic and political too. From Alberta's view, this may look unfair. Alberta can argue that its energy exports help fund the country, that oil revenues support public services, and that Canada cannot build a stronger economy while landlocking one of its biggest assets. From BC's view, it may look like a different kind of unfair. BC gets tanker risk, coastal risk, spill risk, legal conflict, and political blame, while Alberta gets the production upside and Ottawa gets to claim national leadership. That is why the Indigenous ownership structure is so important. If done seriously, it could change the project from something imposed on First Nations into something some Indigenous communities may choose to own, shape, and profit from. But that word matters. Some. Indigenous communities are not one single voice. Inland First Nations along a route may see jobs, equity, and long-term revenue. Coastal First Nations facing tanker traffic may see existential risk. One group's consent cannot erase another group's opposition. And that is where many pipeline debates in Canada break down. Politicians talk about Indigenous partnership like it solves the whole problem. It does not. The hard question is not whether any Indigenous group supports the project. The hard question is whether the project can earn enough consent from the communities whose lands, waters, rights, and economies would be directly affected. And that is why the route options matter so much. A northern route toward Prince Rupert may be strategically attractive because it points directly toward Asia and may avoid some southern congestion. It also fits Alberta's argument that Canada needs a true Pacific export system beyond the already expanded Trans Mountain route into the Vancouver area. But the northern route runs straight into the tanker ban debate. A southern route may be legally and politically different, but supporters describe it as more expensive, more technically complicated, and less aligned with the goal of opening a new northern export corridor. So Alberta is not choosing between easy and hard. It is choosing between different kinds of hard. One route may be more direct to Asian markets, but more explosive politically. Another may be less legally explosive, but more costly or less practical. And no route matters unless shippers sign long-term contracts. That is the quiet part of the story. A pipeline does not get built because a premier wants it. It gets built because companies believe they can make money shipping product through it for decades. There are signs industry wants more capacity. Canadian Natural Resources, Canada's largest oil and gas producer, has tied future oil sands growth to a proposed new 1 million barrel per day pipeline from Alberta to British Columbia's northwest coast. The company's president said further growth depends on expanded pipeline capacity, and a major jackpine expansion was on hold until there is more confidence in pipeline availability. That is a major signal. It shows this is not only a political idea from Alberta's government. At least parts of industry see pipeline access as a condition for future growth. But industry interest is not the same as a final investment decision. Big companies know the risks. They remember Trans Mountain. They remember Keystone XL. They remember Northern Gateway. They remember years of court battles, election changes, protests, regulatory shifts, and cost inflation. So even if oil producers want access to Asia, they may still hesitate to carry the full risk of a new megaproject. This is where Ottawa's role becomes delicate. The federal government wants to show it can build. It wants to show investors that Canada is not trapped in endless consultation and review. It wants to show Alberta that Confederation can still work for an energy-producing province. And under Prime Minister Mark Carney, the broader message has been about making Canada less dependent on the United States, especially after repeated trade threats and a more hostile U.S. political climate. The November 2025 Canada-Alberta Agreement rolled back or changed several climate-related rules while laying groundwork for a new oil pipeline to BC's northwest coast, including possible changes to the tanker moratorium and a faster approval process. That is why this issue is bigger than one pipeline. Carney is trying to hold together two promises that are difficult to hold at the same time. Promise 1. Canada will build major projects faster, unlock energy wealth, and strengthen its economic sovereignty. Promise 2. Canada will still move toward net zero, respect Indigenous rights, and protect sensitive ecosystems. Supporters say those goals can coexist. Critics say this pipeline is the proof that when pressure rises, climate and consent get pushed aside. And the public is split in a more complicated way than the loudest voices suggest. Polling showed that 68% of Canadians supported building a new pipeline to the northern BC coast, and 51% nationally supported the proposal to build a pipeline from Alberta to the north coast of BC. Those numbers matter. They show the idea is not politically dead, but they also come with a warning. Support in a poll is not the same as support during a fight. People may support a pipeline in general. They may support it less if it requires changing the tanker ban. They may support it less if costs rise. They may support it less if First Nations opposition becomes the central story. They may support it less if taxpayers are asked to backstop the project. That is the difference between soft support and durable support. Soft support says, yes, this sounds good. Durable support says, yes, I still support this after the legal costs, the protests, the price tag, the environmental risk, and the political consequences become real. For American viewers, the key issue is leverage. The US has long benefited from Canada's limited export options. When Canadian oil producers have fewer routes to global markets, American refiners often enjoy stronger buying power. A direct pipeline to Asia would not end energy trade with the United States. It would not suddenly break the North American energy system, but it could give Canada more optionality. And in geopolitics, optionality is power. When Washington threatens tariffs, Canada can say it has other customers. When US buyers push prices down, Alberta can look west. When Asia wants secure supply from a stable democracy, Canada can offer itself as an alternative to more politically risky sources. That is the strategic pitch. But the pitch depends on whether Asian buyers actually want to commit long term. Japan and South Korea care about energy security, but they also have climate commitments and changing energy systems. China and India have huge demand, but they are price sensitive and have many supply options. A pipeline to the coast does not automatically guarantee premium prices. It only creates access. Access is valuable, but it is not the same as guaranteed profit. For Canadian viewers, the question is national identity. Canada often talks like a resource superpower, but it frequently acts like a country afraid to build resource infrastructure. Major projects often get stuck in years of federal-provincial conflict, court challenges, regulatory uncertainty, and public distrust. So Alberta's pipeline push has become a test of whether Canada's "build big" language is real. Can the country approve a project that crosses provinces? Can it balance national interest with regional consent? Can it include Indigenous equity without treating Indigenous rights as a checkbox? Can it protect the coast while exporting more oil? Can it attract private capital without quietly shifting risk to taxpayers? Those questions are bigger than oil. They apply to mines, ports, electricity grids, LNG terminals, rail corridors, and clean energy projects too. That is why even people who oppose this pipeline should watch the process closely, because the way Canada handles this fight may shape every major project that comes after it. There is also a climate credibility problem. Canada says it wants to meet long-term climate goals. At the same time, Alberta wants more export capacity for bitumen. Ottawa may argue that Canadian barrels can be lower emission, better regulated, and more reliable than barrels from authoritarian states. That argument has political force. But environmental critics will answer that more export capacity locks in more production, more emissions, and more infrastructure dependence at the exact moment the world should be reducing fossil fuel demand. If Canada wants to export more oil while claiming climate leadership, it cannot rely on slogans. It will need credible emissions policy, credible methane control, credible Indigenous partnership, and credible spill response. Then comes the national unity factor. Alberta has spent years feeling blocked, judged, and economically constrained by federal policy and coastal opposition. The province sees oil as a source of prosperity not just for itself, but for the whole country. When Ottawa restricts market access, many Albertans see that as Canada taking Alberta's wealth while limiting Alberta's future. British Columbia sees the same issue through a different lens. BC is being asked to accept pipeline and tanker risk for a project driven mainly by Alberta production and national export strategy. Coastal communities ask why their water should become the route for someone else's bitumen. Ottawa is caught in the middle. If it sides too strongly with Alberta, it risks a major confrontation with BC and coastal First Nations. If it backs away, it risks deepening Western alienation and proving that Canada's major project promises are empty. This pipeline could become a symbol of national ambition. Or it could become a symbol of national fracture. And both outcomes are still possible. There is also a timing issue. The July 1, 2026 submission target creates pressure, but it does not mean approval is guaranteed. A submission is a start line, not a finish line. The project still needs a route, a proponent, contracts, financing, Indigenous agreements, federal review, provincial navigation, a tanker ban solution, environmental assessment, and public support strong enough to survive years of opposition. This is why the project is both powerful and fragile. Powerful because the strategic logic is obvious. Canada wants more buyers, more leverage, more export options, and less dependence on the US. Fragile because the practical path runs through some of the hardest political terrain in the country. Canada already has more Pacific capacity because of Trans Mountain. Trans Mountain has also launched processes to increase capacity further, with plans that could raise throughput toward roughly 1.19 million barrels per day by later stages. That gives critics a direct argument. Why build a brand new northern pipeline if Canada can squeeze more capacity from existing infrastructure? Why fight the tanker ban if Vancouver area export routes already exist? Supporters will answer that Trans Mountain alone is not enough for Alberta's long-term ambitions. They will say a single Southern Pacific route does not provide true diversification. They will say northern access creates a different strategic corridor. That is the choice. Optimize what exists or build something new. Lower risk and smaller gain, or higher risk and bigger strategic prize. Neither path is simple, and neither path is free. The broader global picture is worth watching too. Asian buyers want reliable energy. The war in Ukraine, Middle East instability, sanctions, and great power competition have all reminded governments that energy is national security. Canada can make a strong pitch as a stable democratic supplier, but to win that role, it needs ports, pipelines, contracts, and political consistency. Asian investors will not commit billions just because Alberta wants a new route. They will look at Canada's track record. They will look at Trans Mountain's cost blowout. They will look at court risk. They will look at the tanker ban. They will look at Indigenous opposition. They will ask one one simple question. Can Canada actually deliver? That question may be the most damaging one of all, because Canada's problem is not that it lacks resources. Canada's problem is that investors often doubt whether resources can be moved to market on time and on budget. Alberta's plan is trying to challenge that reputation, but if the plan collapses, it could reinforce it. So what happens next? First, Alberta and its technical advisors will keep narrowing route options. Second, Ottawa and Alberta will have to show whether the MOU is a real pathway or a political document built to calm tensions. Third, companies will decide whether they are ready to move from advice to commitment. Fourth, Indigenous negotiations will become the center of the story, not a side process, the center. Because without serious Indigenous participation, consultation, and consent where required, this project will not simply face criticism. It could face years of legal and political resistance. Fifth, the tanker ban will become the flashpoint. If Ottawa moves to change it, the fight escalates. If Ottawa refuses to change it, the northern route may be dead before it starts. That is the decision hiding inside the whole debate. Everything else can be studied. The tanker ban has to be confronted. And when that happens, the country will find out whether this pipeline is truly a national project or just a national argument. So here is the clearest way to understand it. Alberta has not built a new pipeline to Asia yet. It has opened the door to the biggest Canadian energy fight of the decade. The opportunity is real. More markets, more leverage, more jobs, more revenue, and less dependence on a single American customer. The risk is just as real. Cost overruns, public backlash, Indigenous opposition, tanker ban conflict, climate pressure, and a global oil market that may not reward late megaprojects the way supporters hope. That is why this story matters, not because one route study guarantees a pipeline, but because Canada is finally being forced to answer a question it has avoided for years. Does it want to be a country that talks about energy power, or a country that can actually build the infrastructure that energy power requires? For now, Alberta has made its move, Ottawa has tied itself to a deadline, and British Columbia's coast has become the battlefield. But the next question is even bigger. If Canada opens the tanker ban fight to move Alberta oil, what other political deal was made behind the scenes to keep the country from splitting apart over energy? In my next video, I am covering the hidden Ottawa-Alberta trade-off behind this pipeline push, and what I found will change how you see this.